Cool. Thank you. And before we also get started, I just want to acknowledge that I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. So right now I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I know that there are people here from all across Victoria who are watching on different lands, and I just want to pay my respects to the elders on where you're from as well. So yeah, this is tips for top inspections. These slides were created by Paula Reid, who is our guest speaker. So she's an OHS officer and trainer at the CPSU SPSF Victorian branch. So she used to work in the union movement in South Australia, became a WorkSafe inspector, and then came over here and is now working at the CPSU. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Paula, who will walk you through everything that you need to know about inspections. So thank you. I'll hand it over to you, Paula.
Thanks for that, Davina. Welcome, everybody. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on today. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any people that are here with us today. So what we're going to be talking about today is workplace inspections, and it's something that is part of the powers of a HSR. Before we get into the powers of a HSR around this, I just wanted to do a bit of a review on the objects and the principles of the Act, which are right at the beginning. They're often overlooked, and I think that they're really, really important because the objects and the principles establish the guiding purpose of the Act, which gives people a better understanding of what the intentions were, why the Act was put there in the first place. So when we look at the objects of the Act, they make it really clear that risks have to be eliminated at the source. Employees, including HSRs, should be involved in the formation as well as the implementation of any OHS standards. So conducting workplace inspections is a really good way of doing this. So we'll have a look next at the principles, Davina. Thanks. Similarly, the principles contained in Section 4 of the Act make it really clear that employers are responsible for controlling risks to health and safety and eliminating or reducing them so far as is reasonably practicable. The principles also require employers, as you can see there, to be proactive and to share information about risks. And it also makes it clear that the employees should be represented in the work. They're not only entitled, but they should be encouraged. So again, that talks about the employer has the responsibility and that they should be proactive, and they have to share information. So again, a workplace inspection is a really good opportunity for an employer to work with the HSRs to make sure that they're being proactive and sharing that information while they do the inspections. So let's have a quick look at the powers of the Health and Safety Rep in relation to workplace inspections. Section 58 of the Act, which I'm sure you've all got your copy in your hot little hand. I don't go anywhere without it. Section 58 of the Act outlines the powers of a HSR. What we have up on the screen here is some but not all of HSR powers. And we should remember that the Health and Safety Rep can only do these things for the purposes of representing the members of their designated work group, or DWG as we call it, and monitoring any measures that are taken by the employer and inquiring into risks of health and safety to their designated work group, and or attempting to resolve any issues in relation to health and safety. So let's have a look then at the power to inspect. Can we just go back a bit?
Sorry.
Okay, so when can we do an inspection? So if Section 58 talks about the Health and Safety Rep can do any of the following: can inspect the workplace at any time after giving reasonable notice to their employer. And they can also take photographs, and this is a fairly recent change, take photographs, measurements, sketches and recordings. They can also accompany a WorkSafe inspector during the inspection, and if they're asked to and their member of their DWG gives permission, they can also attend any interviews with that member of the DWG, whether that person's being interviewed by their employer or indeed by a WorkSafe inspector. They also have the right to seek the assistance of any person, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail later as well. And as I said before, resolving issues through consultation, and they also have the powers to issue PINs or cease works if they can't get any resolution. So that's a bit of an overview of the powers. So, okay, on to the next one. Thanks, Davina. So, hazard and risk. This is one that it can be really easy to get confused. We use the terms hazard and risk fairly interchangeably, but the purpose of a workplace inspection is to identify the hazards and assess the risk, and then eliminate or control the hazards in the workplace. So you can see the definitions there. Basically, the hazard is something that has the potential to cause harm, where the risk is the likelihood. What's the chances of it happening? The harm is obviously what occurs when the hazard is not controlled, and then the controls are the things that we put into place to hopefully either eliminate or reduce the hazard. Regular inspections that are carried out properly will help identify and eliminate or control those risks, and hopefully that leads to higher standards of workplace health and safety. And this is why they're key to the prevention of incidents and improved culture in the workplace, because it's about consultation and cooperation between the HSR representing the DWG and the employer. So we'll have a look at what's the purpose of a workplace inspection in the next slide. So the purpose of a workplace inspection, as I said, is to identify, eliminate or control hazards in the workplace, but it's also having a look at issues that are emerging in the workplace as well. There may be things that you start to see patterns of when you're doing an inspection, whether you do it in one part of the workplace and then you do one in another part, you may see some emerging issues that come out there. It's also looking to identify specific activities that could result in accident or illness. So if there's been a new piece of equipment, which goes to the next bit, have a look at how that's being operated. Is that something that's a new activity that could be causing a specific illness or injury to workers? But it is also a really positive thing too, because it can promote a positive health and safety environment and create that opportunity for better communication. So whilst the employer has a duty to conduct regular inspections, the HSR can initiate an inspection using their powers under the Act. Okay, so we're going to have a look now at what the barriers might be to workplace inspection. This is one we talk a lot to HSRs about in training, because it can be quite difficult when you're a HSR. You've got your regular job and you're doing this other role, which is a voluntary role. And how do you make sure that you've got the time to do it properly? And I think the biggest barrier that we see when we talk to HSRs is that the employer has a lack of knowledge of the powers of a HSR. So this is where it's really useful to use some of the tools that we'll go into at the end of the presentation. Just things like your copies of the Act or information from the OHS Reps website or the WorkSafe website to just remind your employer that you have an entitlement to reasonable time to carry out your role, and you have the power under Section 58 to do those inspections. Things like having the time to carry out the role should be factored into your workload, and it needs to be acknowledged as well as part of your HSR's contribution to the workplace. It shouldn't be a job description, but it should be acknowledged that role contributes positively to the health and safety in the workplace. So a HSR who's completed their 5-day training, for example, they have to be recognised, we believe, as someone who's got sufficient knowledge of OHS to be deemed competent, and it's therefore then formally recognised. I think some of those things like shift work, work overload and the hybrid working, which is a fairly new one during COVID times, that's also created some new barriers. So it's about, again, going back to your employer and having a look at how you can work around some of those barriers to ensure the HSR has sufficient time to carry out the role. And the last one is an interesting one, because members of DWG, designated workgroup, being unaware that inspection is happening. Often a health and safety rep's real keen to get on and do the job, but it's really important to remember that the role is a representative role. So make sure you consult with the people in your DWG and let them know that you're going to be doing an inspection, because as workers, they will help inform what you need to be looking at in that area. And it's a really good opportunity for you to talk to them and get them more active in health and safety issues in the workplace as well, so that you've got some good support when you're raising issues. Okay, so the tools you need for a workplace inspection is going to depend a little bit on what industry you work in and what sort of inspection you're going to be doing. But obviously, if you've got checklists or any guidance notes that you've had from like previous inspections, for example, you might need a clipboard and paper and pen, or a tablet, depending on what sort of user you are. Your camera or your phone for photographs. And also sometimes you might need a monitoring device, things that measure noise or lighting, etc. in the workplace. Now, the employer is supposed to provide with reasonable equipment, or you can look up where you can hire some of those things if you need specialised equipment. So also useful to have a look at any safety notices that have been issued. So industry safety alerts, for example, or reports from previous inspections as well. Sometimes if you have a look at what was come up emerging in other inspections, that can help inform what you need to make sure you look at. And obviously any things like standard operating procedures or policy documents that are relevant to the inspection. Okay. So the other thing is to plan your inspection. Have a look at what's the scope, what's in, what's out, who needs to be involved in the inspection. Sometimes if the issue, for example, is about fatigue in the workplace, whilst that's a health and safety issue, it can also be an industrial issue, depending on what your industrial instrument is. So you might want to consult with the union delegate in that area as well to look at, whether they can assist with doing the inspection with you. Also check any regulations or standards that are likely to be relevant. Again, we'll have a look later in the presentation as to where you can get extra resources, because there's loads of information out there. Sometimes there's quite a lot of information that's useful to know how to sort of sift through it all. And as I said before, have a look at previous inspection reports and data, and any data you might have been given at health and safety consultative committees as well, because that might show, again, emerging trends. And of course, always review and, if necessary, update your inspection checklist, because ones you've used in the past might need to be updated. Okay, so we talked a bit about checklists. The checklists are a really good way of making sure you don't miss anything when you're going through the inspection. And as I said before, not all workplaces are the same, and not all hazards exist in each workplace. So you need to choose a checklist that suits the sort of work carried out in your workplace. I think even before I moved over to Victoria, I used the OHS Reps website extensively. It's a massive amount of really good information, and they've got some really good checklists that are quite specific to different industries or to different hazards that you'll be looking at in the workplace. But as you begin to develop your own checklist, as I said before, develop it in consultation with union delegates, other HSRs from other DWGs. And make sure you consider all of the things around the area that you're going to be going to. So include the environment, any equipment, tools, materials, and also work processes. And also then make sure you include those peripheral areas of the workplace, such as entry and exit, building access, storage, and amenities. And as we said before, make sure you let people in the area know that you're going to inspect and when it's going to happen, and seek the input from the workers in that area. Okay. When you're using the checklist, just focus on the hazards. And we've seen some really good example ones in our training where people have got done them sort of electronically, and they've got locations noted in the comments field, and they either elaborate on the issues in writing or include photographs. The photographs are really, really useful for being able to take a snapshot at a particular point in time. And then have a look at what action might be required to eliminate or reduce the risk of any hazards. Note the actions for follow-up and make sure that those actions are assigned to the appropriate people, the people that have got not responsibility, high up enough the hierarchy in the workplace to have the power to make decisions. And then also make sure you follow up and review any actions that are taken so that things don't drop off the radar. So then sit down, do a bit of a review after you've done the inspection, sit down with the group of people that you've done the inspection with. And if there was any minor issues that weren't rectified, as I said, do it in an action plan with timeframes and make sure somebody's responsible for actioning it. If a risk assessment needs to be done, then make sure that the employer does the risk assessment, but that the HSR is consulted when the risk assessment's done. It's useful to do a report to the DWG about what your outcome and findings were so that they're aware of, what the outcomes are and whether there's anything that they need to have input on. And it's also useful at the end of the day to make sure that a report goes to the Health and Safety Committee for their regular meetings as well. And again, just a reminder that the employer is responsible for controlling hazards, not the HSR. So some of the resources that you can use, first and foremost, of course, your union. Your union is a great resource, and you've got union ARREOs. We do love an acronym. An ARREO is an authorised representative of a registered employee organisation. It's just a very government-like, long-winded way of saying union official. So basically, you can contact the union for any assistance with health and safety matters. And also, if you have not done any HSR training, or if you're up for refresher training, you are entitled to choose your training provider in consultation with your employer. So if you're up for some more training, make sure you contact your union to make sure the courses are available, because as we said, the legislation is changing all the time. So just refreshing your training is a really good way of making sure you're up to date with what's new in the legislation, and the union can help with that. So the OHS Reps website, there's a QR code here as well. As I said, this website is really easy to use, good to navigate. And don't forget, when you go onto the website, to sign up to the Safety Net newsletter if you haven't already. Fantastic newsletter that comes out once a week, packed full of information, and a great resource for HSRs. And as I said, on that website also, there's a lot of a toolkit for HSRs, which includes a huge amount of checklists, some of which are specific to hazards, some of which are specific to industries. So check those out as well. And the only other thing I would say is WorkSafe Victoria. They have a lot of information on their website as well. They've got a guidance document that's been updated really recently. I think it was in May, and you can see a picture of it up there. It's something, again, I carry that around as much as I do my ACT, because it's chock full of really, really useful information. It's got some really good parts in there that establish that the employer must consult, and when they must consult, and how they must consult. I know you dealt with consultation last week a bit, but that's a guidance document that's really good to go back to. And it's also on the WorkSafe webpage. There's a really good checklist for consultation, for making sure that there's consultation happening when those risk assessments that come out of your inspections are conducted properly. So that is probably it from me, I think. Davina, that was really fast. I hope I didn't talk too fast for everybody.
All good. Cool, thank you. And I've just stopped sharing there. And no, it's fine, because we'll go into the question and answers now. And then that means that there's more time for people to jump in with their questions. So I have a question for you first. So something that we see a lot is that, there's a fine line between holding workplace inspections and doing the role of, as part of your powers as a HSR, but then also doing a role of a paid OHS coordinator. So what should HSRs do to ensure that they exercise their powers, but that they aren't being saddled with the responsibility?
Yeah, okay. Look, that's a good question, Davina. You're quite right, because we often see examples of HSRs when they come to our training course where they say, oh, the employer just told me to go off and do the risk assessment. The employer told me that I had to contact maintenance to get that fixed and stuff like that. So, again, it's a reminder that under Section 58 of the Act, which talks about the powers of the health and safety rep, there's also a section in the Act which is 58 and 3 in brackets, and it's a really, really useful piece to be putting up in front of your employer, which says nothing in this Act or the regulations imposes or is taken to impose a function or a duty on a health and safety representative in that capacity. So really what that's saying is that HSRs have powers that include the power to inspect a workplace where their DWG works, but the Act doesn't impose any duties on the HSR. Section 21 of the Act is really, really clear that it's the employer who has the duties. So the easiest measure for a HSR is to just point those parts of the Act out to the employer and say, let's be really clear about what my role is and what your role is. Whilst there's got to be that consultation and inclusion, it's not the HSR's job to be getting things fixed.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Thank you. And so let's say that I am a HSR and I've held my workplace inspection and I found some hazards that need fixing, but my supervisor, they disregard my inspection. What should I do in that case?
Okay, there's a lot of things you can do in relation to that. So first of all, under Section 58, the other thing that you have the power to do is to seek assistance from any other person. So that could initially mean contacting your union for advice initially. You can also, if you've got an agreed issue resolution procedure in your workplace, you can use the issue resolution procedure to go through that process to say, this has not been fixed, where do I take it next? Is it to your boss's boss? in that procedure, it should be really clear about what you do. And if there's no agreed procedure in your workplace, then you can use the procedure that's contained within the OHS regulations. I think it's regulation. Now, grab that, hang on. Sorry about that. Yes, I think it's regulation 25. No, 23. Issue resolution part 2.2. So parties to the resolution and a procedure for reporting issues and then procedure for resolving issues is at section 25, regulation 25. So you can follow those regulations if you don't have an agreed procedure in your workplace. If you can't reach resolution, once you've gone through the procedure, then obviously as a HSA, you've got the power to issue a PIN. That's set out in section 60 of the Act. And if the hazard poses an immediate threat to the health and safety of workers in your DWG, then you can also direct a cease work, which comes under section 74 of the Act. Finally, if your cease work direction is disputed by management, you can also call WorkSafe and ask for an inspector to visit the workplace.
Awesome, thank you. And also I'll just add as well for people that the next event that we have on managing conflict is next Thursday, the 30th. And before you leave, I'll send you all with details of it and where to sign up. But so that will cover section 73, section 60 and section 74, which is all about cease work and issuing PINs and what to do to like kind of escalate things in the workplace. So, thanks for that, Paula. I also have another question. So you mentioned before about seeking the assistance of any person. So is that only about like advice, or can you seek assistance when conducting the inspection as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely you can, yeah. So when I said before, like decide who's going to be part of the team that's conducting the inspection with you. As I said, you might want to get one of the union delegates to go around with you because they have a particular knowledge of an area. And of course, if you're doing a specific inspection that's going to require you looking at technical equipment, you may want to talk to the workers that use that equipment because they're going to have the best knowledge of some of the things that you probably need to look for that you may not know about yourself. And that goes for an employer's doing an inspection as well. You know, that's why that we say that they've got to consult with the employees, because often the employees know, you know, a lot more about a particular function than the employer does. And also just another HSR from another DWG, sometimes a fresh set of eyes can identify hazards that some people in another area have come to accept. You know, we see all the time where people, low-level work-related violence, people don't report it because they see it as part of their job. They see it as normal. So having somebody come in fresh can assist with those sorts of things as well.
Awesome, thank you. And also, I just saw that some hands came up. If you want, you can chuck your question in the chat, or we can throw it to you in a second. So I just have a few more questions and then we'll put it to anybody that is here. So what are the things that HSR should look out for when they're conducting an inspection?
Okay, so like I said, I think that that's really going to depend on what industry you work in, what sorts of things are going to be identified in your workplace. So as a or looking at checklists, using a checklist is probably the best way to go about that, because then you've got parameters to help you from start to finish so that you don't miss something out. But yeah, I guess it's just going to be, yeah, it's going to depend on what sort of industry you work in. I mean, some of the higher risk industries are going to be conducting inspections that are quite different to other areas, and some of the industries such as healthcare, you know, they're going to be quite specific to the different sorts of tasks that people undertake in those areas.
Awesome, cool. And my final question is that, and it's something that I'm like kind of conscious of as one of the people that update all the checklists and stuff on the OHS Reps website. A lot of people use those checklists, and you know, when they download it, it won't necessarily have everything that they need or like every single hazard that's going to be in their workplace. So like what kind of things should HSRs do when they're using that checklist to like kind of identify hazards and, you know, like kind of make it so that it fits in their workplace?
Yeah. Well, of course, you know, a checklist or an audit tool is always a living document. So if there's things that come to you when you're using that and you think, oh, actually, that's not even contained in this checklist, then, you know, free to add those sorts of things in there, because it's something that's you know, can be changed and adapted to suit whatever the needs are at the time you're using it. And at different times, you know, not only does the legislation change, but also the what's known in the industry will change as well. And so expectations may change in between you doing one checklist and then you go to do an inspection 6 months later and you think, well, actually, the Australian standard for this has changed, or, you know, the legislation for that has changed. And that might change, you know, the parameters of your checklists as well. So it's always useful to just, you know, make those changes and work with the group. You know, I said work with your you know, with your other HSRs and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. So it all comes back to working with other HSRs and your DWD at the end. Awesome. Cool. And we have some questions coming in through the chat. This question is, how have you included psychological hazards in an inspection? Sorry, you're on mute there.
Gosh, you would think after 2 years we wouldn't do that anymore. Sorry.
No, it's all good.
Okay, that's a really good question. I think that, again, you need to be looking at some sort of specific checklist that's going to identify psychosocial hazards. And I know that when we did the OHS Reps conference, was it last year, the year before, I think you guys developed a really good audit tool for that. And I noticed when I was doing some research for this that you guys also have a violence at the workplace safety audit on your website. So again, I would just say, just do some research and you will find lots of stuff that's really useful for putting into your checklist. There's also, I think, I haven't got it to hand, but I'm pretty sure that WorkSafe in their work-related stress guidance document, I think they have, like, it's not a checklist, but it's like a hazards identification sort of part at the back of that guidance document. You could probably turn that into a checklist if you wanted to as well.
Awesome, thank you. I was just having a look at our website to try and find the psychological checklist, because I'm fairly sure, I wasn't working here at the time, but I'm fairly sure that we do have one. So when I find it, I'll send it in the chat, or I'll definitely send it around to all the attendees. But that was great. Thanks, Paula. The next question that we have is, should the checklist identify the level of risk?
No, I would say that, I mean, look, when you're doing the actual inspection, I think the point of the checklist is to identify that there is something there. I think that if during the conversation while you're doing the inspection that there's an identification that something needs to be done about that immediately, then certainly, you know, that should happen. But I don't think necessarily the checklist, it's different to a risk assessment. I would say that the checklist is sort of your first step in the process. And anything that can't be fixed right there and then would then either go on a list of things to be fixed that can still be done relatively easily. And if there's something, like I said, if you've had a new piece of equipment that was put in, say, 6 months ago, and part of your inspection is to talk to the workers around whether there's been particular issues with that equipment or lack of training or something like that. If that's something that they say, well, look, we've had 5 people go off on work cover because some of the shelves in this sterilisation cupboard are too high for people to reach, and so they're injuring themselves trying to do the job. So then I would say that's when you say, well, okay, we actually need to do a proper risk assessment on this piece of equipment because clearly it's not fit for purpose for the people that are using it. So that would, I think, then be a separate process as the risk assessment identified in the checklist, but you wouldn't necessarily be identifying the level of risk at the checklist stage.
Awesome, thank you. Great answer. And I'll just also note that I ended up finding what I was talking about before. So I was wrong. It wasn't a psychological checklist, but a psychosocial risk survey. But it included a bunch of stuff that I think would be useful for a checklist. And it's really good, Liz, that you brought that up, because like I said, I'm one of the people that updates the tools and stuff on the website. So that's a really great thing to include with all of our checklists and stuff. So I've just sent that through, and then I'll go on to the next question. So this one comes in the chat and it's from Vivian. Our management have previously tried to mandate HSRs take part in routine lab inspections. The routine inspections are directed as part of the organization's WHS management policy. HSRs on the site have been a bit ambivalent about this. There's good recognition on one hand, but it's being used as a management tool on the other. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Okay, without knowing all of the details, I would say that, look, it can be very easy to fall into the trap where management's ticking a box and saying, oh, well, they were in the inspection, so we consulted, so therefore everything's tickety-boo. I think that you do need to be careful about that. But I would suggest that if you're in any doubt about any part of an inspection or why you think the employer is doing it in a particular way, it's useful just to touch base with your union and just see if they can give you some advice, because it could be something quite technical, especially if it's in a lab or whatever. There may be a reason why. I mean, as you said, it's on the one hand, it's great they're consulting with people and making sure that they're talking to the people that are experts in that job. But on the other hand, it's about not making sure that responsibility is put on the HSR. So, it's a fine line, but I would be saying in that particular industry, get advice from your union as to whether they're overstepping the mark.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. We have another question, and we have a lot of really great questions coming in, so everybody keeps sending them through. So it's good that we got the presentation over with, so we could get through to all of this. As a HSR, are you obliged to stick with the checklist developed by the employer as part of their WHS inspections?
Again, I would say no. I think it's great they've developed a checklist, and it's great that they're consulting. But the whole point of consulting, and I think we said at the very beginning about the objects and the principles, is that the purpose of consultation and how an employer must consult is to ensure that HSRs are involved in the development of policies and documents in the workplace, not just given an opportunity to comment on them once they've been developed. So I would say if there's a checklist that the employer's developed and you think it's not adequate, I will be saying that you need further consultation in relation to that, so it can be changed to suit what you need it for as a group.
Awesome. And so this question has just come in. Is an elected OHS rep only permitted to inspect their DWG area, or can they cross over into another area where no OHS rep exists?
That's a good one. Yes, because that's in section 59. It talks about powers are generally limited to a particular designated work group. But if there's immediate risk to health and safety that affects people in another designated work group, or if that person asks for the representative's assistance and it's not feasible for their own HSR to assist them, then they can. So in a workplace where the HSR in one area has gone on annual leave and there's no deputy, for example, it will be feasible for that person to go and do that in another area if they're asked to do so by the DWG, or indeed if they have identified something and they say, well, look, the other HSR's not here, so I need to pick this up and run with it with the employer. But remembering that that's why it's useful to have a deputy health and safety reps in your DWG, but it's actually even more effective if you elect 2 HSRs instead of 1, so that you've generally got better coverage if one goes on leave.
2's better than 1. And we have this question comes in, which is really important for these days. So with the increase of employees working from home and the current definition in the active workplace, do you have any advice or guidance to employers to ensure these home working spaces and employers' obligations can be met through inspections?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and it's certainly one that our union has been grappling with for the entire period of COVID. We've had a huge cohort of workers that, of course, on the front lines work straight through, but we've also had quite a number of people that have been doing the working from home requirements. Look, it can be quite difficult to, if you talk about from the employer's perspective, it can be quite difficult for them to ensure entirely that, you know, the employee's work home space is you know, completely up to speed. But obviously, again, there's tools that you can use. And I know that there's WorkSafe guidance that's really quite detailed in ergonomic setups for offices. And that office would then also include your workspace at home. So it's the same as at the workplace. And I know, we all know that during COVID, we've had loads and loads of people that have not been working in very good ergonomic conditions. And I expect there'll probably be a big spike in work cover claims in relation to those ergonomic conditions. But I think the thing is that, again, checklists are really useful for that sort of stuff. And even even in our own workplace, our health and safety manager, you know, required us to fill in a form that had a full-on checklist, and we had to show photographs of our space so that they could satisfy themselves as an employer that we were working in ergonomically, good place, and they made sure that we had access from the office to our home for things like a decent chair and a desk and your keyboard, and making sure that our screens were set up. So I think that, again, it's that working with your employer and, you know, as an employer, develop a checklist in consultation with the workers, but then require them to fill it in and send it back. And if there's any disputes, then ultimately you could probably ask WorkSafe for some advice in terms of they have ergonomists and stuff there.
Awesome. Yeah, it'll be really interesting in the future to kind of see where all of this goes. So we have this one question come in. As a 12-hour shift worker, should a duty such as carrying out a workplace inspection be within your working hours?
Yeah, again, we get this one a lot in some of our work areas where people work quite long shifts and often find it very difficult to make the time to do these sorts of things. Certainly, in our view, any workplace inspection should be conducted during your own working time, not in your own time. And if those opportunities, if, say, for example, you're a permanent night shift worker, again, we've had these conversations with our HSRs in training, there should be some consideration made by the employer to make sure you can be included in things like the Health and Safety Consultative Committee, for example. I mean, if the Consultative Committee is always held during the day, there's got to be that accommodation so that people can at least have some input and attend things like meetings. So a workplace inspection will be the same. We would say the employer must accommodate that as part of the obligations to a health and safety rep.
Awesome. Cool. And what happens if there is a risk but no HSR? Where do we start to get one?
Wow. Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so that's another whole process in terms of agreeing your designated work groups and electing HSRs. You could probably do 2 more whole sessions on those 2 things because putting your DWG together is a whole process that the workers in their workplace. It's an employee-led process where workers need to decide what their DWG should look like and then to elect HSRs. But if you don't have a HSR at the moment and you need to get something addressed, then obviously the best place to go to in the immediacy would be to see your union. If you're members of a union, because the union can start that whole process for you and work with you to make sure that that's being addressed, but also you're then looking further down the long term to make sure that you get your DWG set up and get your HSRs elected and then send them to training.
Awesome, thank you. And so we also covered DWGs and electing HSRs in our OHS Fundamentals workshop. So what I'll do is go grab the, I'm getting my coworker to grab the link and then we'll send it over so people who don't have a HSR can watch it, because if there's one thing that we've learned from all of these live shows, but in particular this one, is that it's really, really important to have a HSR in your workplace. Awesome. So we have one question come in from Val. If a HSR is on long-term work cover until further notice, can another colleague from the same DWG help with inspections? If so, must they have some form of training, even if it's an informal?
Okay. Look, you don't have to be a HSR to be involved in a workplace inspection if you're doing it in conjunction with your employer. If as an employee you wanted to conduct your own inspection, I would say that could land you badly because under the Act, the HSR is protected. their powers are protected. So I don't think a worker has the same exact protections as a HSR does to just go off and do an inspection whenever, you know, they've just given notice. But I think if there's no HSR in that group, it would certainly be entirely reasonable for an employee of that group to say, hey, I'm happy to put my hand up and do the inspection. And in terms of training, that I don't think there's a requirement for any sort of formal training, but certainly, like anything under the Act, the employer always has a duty of care, and they have an obligation to make sure that people are suitably, where is it? In section 21, I'm pretty sure, if I can just indulge. I know some of the people here know this stuff off by heart. Okay, so yes, it is section 21. The duty of the employer to all employees in part E, 1E, is to provide information, instruction, training and supervision to employees that is necessary to enable them to perform their work in a way that is safe and without risk to health. So I would extrapolate that to say that if that employer is saying, hey, there's no HSR, but you can help me do this inspection, then the employer would have a duty of care to make sure that person's got adequate information and instruction and training to be able to effectively carry out a workplace inspection.
Awesome.
Sorry, I've just unmuted, so I don't have to keep typing. I had a question about that same thing. Just so the other employee, the lovely little helper, is legally covered, do they need to stick to the HSRs during the inspections? Like, do they have to be glued, literally?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking though.
Yeah, because like you said that it's fine for another workmate to join the HSR for an inspection if, you know, there's no HSRs on site. But just so like we're practicing safely, does that other colleague have to stick to the HSR during the inspection at all times? So
do you mean that do they have to stick with the employer? You were saying the HSR is not there, so an employee is doing the inspection with the employer, is that correct?
Yeah, so like if myself as HSR, I'm conducting an inspection tomorrow. If I'm getting a workmate to help me out with it, does that workmate have to stick to me during the inspection at all times? Like we have to be together throughout the whole inspection? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Look, I think that's probably a bit too detailed for me to be in the sense that I don't know where you work, what sort of workplaces, what sort of risks, hazards there are. Sorry, in the workplace. I think if you are, you know, walking around a workplace, say for example, if I was to be walking around a prison, for example, I'm sure it would be really, really important for me to stick to the person that I'm going around there with. My own health and safety. So it would depend a lot on the workplace, and it would depend a lot on what's the purpose of the inspection, who's doing the inspection, and stuff like that. But, you know, it could be seen as a risk to the health and safety of the person that's doing the HSR if they were to just wander off, you know, if they fall down into a piece of machinery or something, then it's not a good look, is all I'm saying. No. So I can't answer that definitively, but all I'm saying that, yeah.
No, it makes sense. No, because like I work in an inpatient psych ward, you know, there's risks of all colors. So like my personal feeling would be like, if I have to get another colleague, I would tell the colleague to stick with me at all times just to be safe in case things happen. I wasn't sure whether this kind of approach of mine is like legally mandated or not. That's all.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, as I say, I mean, obviously a HSR can ask anyone to assist. So they can ask the work colleague to assist them if they're carrying out an inspection. But I don't think I mean, if somebody else is on here that knows more about this than I do, feel free to. But I'm not aware of anything that specifically says if you're conducting an inspection, you must, you know, stick by the HSR. But I will look while we're chatting.
No, thanks for that.
Awesome, thank you. And we have another question come in. Does a HSO have to address a risk worker's identity when there is no HSR?
I'm not sure, again, to address a risk worker's identity. Oh, so you're saying the identification of the worker that is at risk?
Catherine, if you're still here, that was your question. Can you clarify on that?
You just have to address the risk workers identify.
If you're not here, then the next question, same person, how can you identify, how can you encourage people to take up the HSR role? And also I'll just add that my colleague Reese has sent through to the chat the OHS Basics Month OHS Fundamentals video that's on our Facebook. So that covers everything around electing a HSR and setting up DWGs.
Okay, so in terms of encouraging people to take up the HSR role, I guess one of the things we say to people when they come to our first training, the 5-day initial training, one of the first things we say to them is, you know, just because you're doing a 5-day training course does not mean you are expected to come out of this as an expert in occupational health and safety, by no means. There's a lot of support and a lot of information, a lot of resources out there. So I guess if I was going to be encouraging someone to be a HSR, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's a really vital role in the workplace, and the more HSRs we've got, the better. But I would also tell them to make sure that they've got support from their union as well, because that's what I found when I first started out a very long time ago. It's just having people there that have got that experience in the industry you work in, and they understand the nature of some of the hazards as well as you do. It's good to have that support there. And, you know, you can maybe arrange a short session with your colleagues and get somebody from the union to come and talk to you about health and safety reps, what the role looks like, and what sort of protections and support there is under the Act, because it's a very powerful role in the workplace, and it does come with a certain level of protections as well as powers and a lot of obligations from the employer. So it's a very worthwhile role.
Awesome. And so our final question in the chat, and then we'll switch off the recording and people can jump in with any other questions that they don't want recorded. But so this one isn't quite around inspections. I'll throw it at you anyway and see if you you might have worked with this in your organising, but ventilation is an ongoing problem being raised by staff in office workplaces as a control measure for COVID. What's your advice on tackling ventilation with employers?
Okay, so again, that could be a whole nother session, quite frankly. Certainly, yes, we've been dealing with a lot of inquiries, especially as people are starting to be going back to the work. I guess what I would say in the first instance would be to get some research, do some research. And I would start with the OHS Reps website. There's a lot of really good information on the website in relation to ventilation in workplaces. There's also a lot of stuff on the WorkSafe website now. So I think, you know, from my perspective, it's the same as any issue. Arm yourself with the information first, go and do your research, talk to your union. They may already have policies in place from other workplaces that they can share with you as well. And then, you know, same as any other issue that you raise, you've got an opportunity to consult with your employer and talk through what the issues might be. And then try and come to some sort of a resolution with them in relation to any concerns that people have raised. And if a risk assessment needs to be done in relation to that, then again, use those tools that are on all the websites to do a risk assessment and in relation to whether the ventilation in a particular workplace is adequate. Again, if you're in dispute with your employer in relation to that, I would say seek assistance from your union. And of course, the other thing you can do is that you can seek advice from WorkSafe as well. So you can ring their advisory line and just talk to them over the phone, or you can ask for an inspector to come to the workplace and do an inspection as an inspector as well. So yeah, there's lots of things you can do.
Well, thank you, Paula. And I'll just add that I sent through in the chat our page on ventilation. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, we've created a ventilation checklist for you know, HSRs to use, print off, and using their inspections. We also did a webinar similar to this on ventilation a few months ago. So I've added the YouTube link as well. So that's all the questions that we have. So we'll stop the recording now and then get to any other questions for people if they want to jump in. Sorry, we also just had one question pop in. So does a HSR have to be a union member to get support from the union?
Okay, that's a really good question. I can't speak on behalf of all unions, but generally speaking, my experience over the years, you have to be a union member in order to get the benefits of union membership. And one of those, of course, is having all of those people on hand to be able to give you advice and assistance in your workplace. So you don't have to be a union member as a HSR to go to union training and HSR training. So the training's a really good place to start with that sort of stuff. But in terms of, like if you were going to be calling a cease work or writing a PIN in your workplace, you probably wouldn't want to be ringing a union if you're not a member and asking one of the OHS people or an industrial person to go through that with you. It wouldn't be reasonable because you're not a member. Hope that's not too harsh. That's join your union.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula.